Narrator, deep, reflective tongue. There was a time when the Muslims of the subcontinent walked with pride. Their names echoed in the halls of power. Their scholars shaped knowledge, their leaders defined justice, and their warriors guarded honor. From Delhi to Deccan, the rhythm of their civilization beat strong, balanced between faith and reason, between the sword and the pen. But as time moved on, they began to fade. What was once a thriving empire turned into a tale of silence, humiliation, and despair. When the Mughal Empire fell, it wasn't just a dynasty that collapsed. It was a civilization's confidence that crumbled. The once mighty nation found itself under the feet of foreign masters. Their mosques still stood tall, but their hearts were broken. Their palaces still glimmered, but their spirit was gone. A deep darkness spread across the land, not a darkness of night, but of the soul. Narrate us somberly. The British had conquered India, but more than that, they conquered the minds of its people. They ruled not just through force, but through ideology. They taught the Muslims to doubt themselves, to forget their history, to despise their own traditions. Their language was replaced. Their values were mocked. Their heroes were erased. A nation that once gave light to the world was now told it was backward, unworthy of progress, unfit for power. And what's worse, the Muslims began to believe it. They began to see themselves through the eyes of their oppressors. They accepted inferiority as destiny. The chains of slavery were no longer visible on their hands. They were engraved on their hearts. The once proud followers of the crown, the bearers of Iqra, the command to read, to learn, to rise, had fallen into silence. The flame of faith that had once illuminated the world now flickered weakly in the wind of colonial arrogance. Narrator's voice rising with emotion. In every corner of the subcontinent, the signs of decline were visible. The courts that once sang with the verses of poets now echoed with the commands of foreigners. The madrasas that once produced philosophers and scientists now struggled to survive. Poverty spread like disease, education became a privilege, and power became a memory. The Muslims were no longer leaders of destiny. They were subjects of an empire that viewed them as relics of a forgotten age. The tragedy was not just political. It was moral, intellectual, and spiritual. The Muslim mind had been colonized. The idea of greatness had been replaced by obedience. The concept of faith had been replaced by fear. They prayed, yes, but their prayers had no fire. They worked, yes, but without purpose. They lived, yes, but without pride. It was as if their souls had fallen asleep. Narrator, with soft sorrow, this was the world Allama Iqbal was born into. A world of shadows where light was only a memory. A world where Muslims had forgotten their identity, their mission, their place in history. They had once ruled lands from Spain to India, but now they struggled to rule their own hearts. The colonial system had not only taken their political power, it had stolen their spiritual direction. The West defined progress, and the East followed. The British defined education, and the Muslims accepted. The modern world was being built, but the Muslim stood on the sidelines, uncertain of his own worth. In every village, in every classroom, in every court, there was a quiet surrender. The surrender of dignity, the surrender of thought, the surrender of faith. The Muslims had become spectators in their own story. Narrator, a reflective pause. It is said that the greatest form of slavery is when a man forgets that he is a slave. That was the tragedy of the Muslims in Iqbal's time. They no longer remembered what freedom truly meant. They believed freedom was only the right to survive, not the power to define destiny. The British were not just rulers. They were teachers, shaping a generation that knew how to obey, but not how to think. Everywhere Iqbal looked, he saw imitation of Western thought, Western dress, Western speech. The Muslims no longer believed in their own ideals. Their sense of Ummah, of brotherhood and unity, had been shattered into sects and tribes. They debated theology but forgot morality. They clung to rituals but abandoned reason. The body of the nation still existed, but the spirit was gone. Narrator, tone deepens. Iqbal would later call this the age of spiritual death, because what is a nation without purpose? What is faith without understanding? What is freedom without self-respect? The Muslims had lost all three. They were like a bird that once soared high, but now crawled on the ground, unable to remember it ever had wings. The British understood this better than anyone. They knew that as long as the Muslims remained asleep, as long as they forgot their identity, they would never rise again. And so they encouraged division. They promoted language over religion, culture over unity, imitation over originality. They built schools that taught the Muslim child to be ashamed of his own faith, to see his ancestors as failures, and to look to the West for salvation. And slowly, generation after generation, the chain tightened. The Muslim's tongue spoke foreign words. His mind carried foreign ideas. His dreams were no longer his own. He prayed to Allah, but sought approval from the British. He recited the Quran, but lived by Western values. It was a slavery of thought, silent, invisible, and deadly. Narrator, slightly hopeful tone emerging. But even in this darkness, there were whispers, faint echoes of resistance. The soul of the nation had not completely died. It was wounded, sleeping, waiting to be awakened. There were scholars who still spoke of truth. There were poets who still remembered honor. There were hearts that still burned with faith. The soil of the subcontinent still carried the memory of greatness. It only needed a voice to awaken it. Iqbal was destined to become that voice. But before he could awaken others, he first had to understand the depth of the nation's sleep. He saw Muslims worshipping habitually, but living without purpose. He saw them quoting the Quran, but fearing the rulers. He saw their pride in the past, but no vision for the future. And he realized this was not just political slavery, it was slavery of the soul. Narrators, emotion building. He understood that no empire can rule forever by the sword, The real power lies in shaping minds. And if the Muslims were ever to rise again, it would not begin with politics, but with thought. It would not begin with rebellion, but with realization. Iqbal saw that the battle for freedom would not be fought in parliaments or streets, but within the hearts of men who had forgotten who they were. The condition of the Muslims in that era was not just a historical tragedy. It was a spiritual warning. It was the story of what happens when a nation loses faith in itself. When knowledge becomes imitation, when religion becomes ritual, when courage becomes silence. The chains that bound them were invisible, made of ignorance, fear, and hopelessness. Narrator, slow, reflective tongue, that was the darkness before Iqbal. A darkness deeper than colonialism, deeper than oppression. It was the darkness of a soul that had forgotten its own light. A nation that once carried the message of God to the world now needed someone to remind it of its divine purpose again. The land of saints, scholars, and poets was waiting for a new voice, a voice that would tell them that the key to freedom was not in the hands of others, but within their own hearts. Her music lingers, fading into silence. Her chant, soft piano and flute begin, carrying a mood of dawn, quiet, thoughtful, awakening. Narrator gentle, steady toned. From the ashes of defeat, from the ruins of forgotten pride, a voice was born, soft at first, yet destined to echo through the ages. In the small city of Sialkot, a child entered, a word weighed down by sorrow and confusion, but within him burned a light that no empire could extinguish. His name was Muhammad Iqbal. He would grow not only to become the poet of the East, but the philosopher of awakening, the mind that would remind a sleeping nation of who they truly were. Narrator, slightly rising Tony. In the narrow streets of Sialkot, Iqbal's early life was marked by simplicity. His father, a man of deep spirituality, taught him the essence of sincerity and truth. His mother, gentle and wise, filled his heart with compassion. From his earliest years, Iqbal was surrounded by faith, not the faith of ritual, but the faith of purpose. He was a quiet child, observant, thoughtful. The sound of the azan stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't yet name. A longing to understand why his people, once leaders of the world, had fallen into despair. Narrator's warmed Tony. As he grew, his hunger for knowledge became relentless. In the classrooms of Sialkot and later at Government College Lahore, Iqbal stood apart. His teachers saw in him a spark, a rare blend of intellect and imagination. He wasn't content to memorize ideas. He wanted to understand truth itself. While others saw poetry as entertainment, he saw it as revelation, a bridge between man and meaning. Every verse he wrote was a question to the world, and every silence he kept was a search within himself. Narrator, thoughtful, slow. In Lahore, he encountered Western philosophy and modern science. He read deeply Aristotle, Plato, Hegel, Nietzsche. He studied logic, law, and literature. But amidst all the brilliance of Western thought, Iqbal noticed something missing. Something that the East had once given to humanity, the soul. The West had intellect, reason, and progress, but it had lost its spiritual compass. The East had faith, love, and meaning, but it had lost its confidence. And in that imbalance, Iqbal saw the sickness of his age. He realized that both worlds, East and West, were incomplete without each other. The West, he thought, needed heart. The East needed awakening. And he decided that he would become the bridge between the two. Narrator, firm tone. It was this realization that took him to Europe. First to Cambridge, then to Munich. He wanted to see with his own eyes the civilization that had conquered the world not by faith, but by reason. In the grand halls of learning, surrounded by scholars and scientists, Iqbal absorbed everything he could. He studied political philosophy, economics, psychology, every discipline that explained how the modern world functioned. He wanted to understand why the Muslims had fallen behind and what the secret of renewal could be. But as he studied deeper, he began to see cracks in the foundation of the Western world. Yes, they had progress, but no peace. They had machines, but no meaning. They had power, but no purpose. He wrote in his diary how he felt a strange emptiness in the heart of Europe. A civilization that had conquered the earth, but lost its soul. And in those years abroad, while others were dazzled by Western glory, Iqbal's faith grew even stronger. He didn't reject the West. He understood it. But he knew that without spiritual guidance, progress could destroy itself. He said that the East must rise again, not to imitate the West, but to balance it, to bring back the moral center of civilization. Narrator da reflective ton. In Germany, Iqbal earned his doctorate in philosophy, writing on the development of metaphysics in Persia. But while the world saw a scholar, Iqbal saw a mission unfolding. His heart was restless, his mind alive. He began to sense that Allah had chosen him for a purpose beyond academia. He had studied the best minds of the world, and now he was ready to speak to the heart of his people. When he returned to India, he was no longer just Muhammad Iqbal. He was Iqbal the visionary, the one who had seen both East and West, the one who could now speak with authority to a broken nation. He saw his people still chained by ignorance, their potential wasted under colonial education, their religion reduced to mere customs. They had forgotten that Islam was not just a religion of rituals. It was a way of life, a system of thought, a code of dignity. Iqbal's poetry began to change. It was no longer just beautiful words. It became a weapon. His verses carried fire, challenging the old mindset of submission. He spoke not to entertain, but to awaken. He questioned the Muslims, asking them if they remembered the power they once held, the message they once carried, the courage they once lived. Narrator with passion, he said, Uto meri dunya ki gariban ko jagadu, kaki, omra ki daro, diwa hiladu. He wasn't writing poetry for art. He was calling for revolution. His pen became the sword of truth. His message was simple freedom begins in the soul. Before you can rise as a nation, you must rise as a man. Before you can rule the world, you must rule yourself. Iqbal understood that the greatest danger to Muslims was not external oppression, but internal decay. But the British could not rule forever. But the fear they had planted in the hearts of Muslims could. So he attacked that fear directly. He told his people that Allah does not change the condition of a nation until it changes what is within itself. His verses reminded them that they were not meant to live in defeat. They were born to lead. Narrator, steady, emotionally grounded, Iqbal's lectures, his writings, and his gatherings in Lahore began to draw attention. Students, scholars, and common men alike felt the energy of his words. He spoke with conviction, not just of philosophy, but of purpose. He would stand before crowds and speak of Khudi, the self, the divine spark within every human being. And as he spoke, people began to feel something stir within them. A memory of pride, a longing for faith, a hunger for freedom. He had returned to awaken his people, but he also knew awakening would not come easily. The chains of centuries could not be broken overnight. The Muslims had forgotten how to think freely, how to question authority, how to dream. But Iqbal believed that every revolution begins in the heart. And so he aimed straight for the heart of his people. Through poetry, through prayer, through philosophy. Narrator softer, reflective tonim. What made Iqbal's birth as a thinker so extraordinary was that he refused to choose between East and West. He took the best of both. From the West, he learned the discipline of reason. From the East, he carried the flame of faith. And then he fused them into a new vision, a vision of the modern Muslim, educated, confident, spiritual, and strong. He began to teach that Islam was not opposed to progress. Islam was progress when rightly understood. It was not a religion of the past, but a guide for the future. He called on Muslims to rediscover the Quran as a living force, not a relic. He reminded them that Islam had once created thinkers, scientists, poets, and leaders who transformed the world, and that it could do so again. Narrator. So calmly, building momentum, the birth of Iqbal the thinker was not a sudden moment. It was a long journey through doubt, discovery, and devotion. He had seen the world, learned its secrets, and returned with a new truth. That the real power of a nation lies not in wealth or weapons, but in the strength of its ideas. And his own idea was about to ignite a movement that would change history forever. A music swells, the tone of voice lowers, filled with conviction. Narrator, deeply reflective. Iqbal had found his purpose, to rebuild the soul of a nation that had forgotten how to dream. He would not fight with armies, but with words. He would not conquer lands, but hearts. He would not build monuments, but minds. Because he knew that the real revolution always begins within. A soft ambient sound fades in. The faint rhythm of a pen scratching on paper, the murmur of wind, the echo of a restless voice searching for truth. Narrator, calm, reflective Tony. Every revolution begins not in the streets, not in the halls of power, but in the mind. And that is where Allama Iqbal chose to fight his greatest battle. Not against armies, but against the invisible chains that bound the Muslim spirit. The chains of fear, of imitation, of inferiority. He looked around and saw a nation enslaved not by foreign rulers, but by its own thoughts. The British may have ruled their bodies, but despair ruled their souls. Iqbal's mission was clear: to free the Muslim mind from its own captivity. Narrator, slowly, with intensity, he saw Muslims living under a delusion that freedom could come from political slogans or rebellion alone. But Iqbal knew that real freedom begins long before the battlefield. It begins in the soul, when a man realizes who he is. When a nation remembers its worth. He said that the first prison is not made of stone. It is built within the heart that accepts defeat. The moment you believe you are weak, you have already surrendered. And so Iqbal began to speak, not of politics, but of Khudi, the awakening of the self. He told his people that before they could change their destiny, they had to change their mindset. The chains they wore were invisible, but they were heavy, made of hopelessness, made of self-doubt, made of ignorance. He wanted to break those chains one thought at a time. Narrator, A's passionate, steady rhythm, in his poetry, he wrote verses that struck like lightning. Khudi ko karbalind, itna ki har takdiya sipel, kuda bandi sikad puchi, bada teri raza klea hai. He wasn't just writing poetry. He was giving his people a new philosophy of life. He was reminding them that man was not created to bow before anyone except God, that true servitude belongs to the Creator alone, and any other form of submission to colonial power, to cultural pressure, to mental slavery was a betrayal of that divine trust. Iqbal's message was dangerous to the status quo. It threatened those who wanted the Muslims to remain silent and compliant. But he didn't care. His pen became a weapon sharper than any sword, and his words spread like fire through the hearts of the young. Narrator, rising energy, he taught that the human being is not powerless, that Allah has placed within every person the potential to rise, to create, to transform. He said that the greatest tragedy of the Muslims was not their loss of power, it was their loss of belief in themselves. The Quran spoke of man as the Khalifa, the vicegerent of God on earth, but how could a Khalifa live in fear? How could a chosen nation accept chains around its hands and mind? Iqbal called this condition spiritual death, a state in which a man breathes, but his soul is asleep. He saw that education under colonial rule had turned Muslims into imitators. They learned Western sciences, but forgot Eastern wisdom. They memorized books, but forgot their purpose. Their degrees gave them status, but not direction. Iqbal challenged that illusion. He said, education must liberate, not domesticate. It must produce leaders, not followers. A mind trained only to obey is not educated, it is conditioned. Narrator, softer yet piercing tone, Iqbal began to question the very foundation of his people's thinking. He asked, why do you measure yourself by the standards of others? Why do you seek validation from the world when your Creator has already honored you? He wanted to destroy the disease of inferiority that had paralyzed the Muslims. He reminded them of their history, of the days when their ancestors led the world in science, philosophy, and morality. He told them that the secret of their decline was not the strength of the West, but the weakness of their own will. In gatherings and lectures, Iqbal would speak of selfhood, not as arrogance, but as divine consciousness. To him, Khudi meant knowing your purpose, your origin, and your destiny. It meant realizing that every human being carries within himself a spark of divine energy, a reflection of God's will, and that to strengthen this self is to draw closer to Allah, to live with courage, to act with conviction. Narrator, a passionate whisper, he said that when Khudi awakens, man ceases to fear death, because death is not the end for one who lives with purpose. The fear of death, Iqbal said, is the root of all slavery, political, social, and spiritual. Once you conquer that fear, no power on earth can enslave you. Through poetry, he gave examples: the falcon, the desert wind, the mountain, all symbols of strength, independence, and movement. He wanted the Muslims to become like the falcon, proud, self-reliant, unafraid of height, untouched by greed. He used nature itself as a metaphor for freedom. He wrote that every creature fulfills its purpose except man, who forgets his. And the moment man forgets, he becomes less than what he was meant to be. Narrator, rhythmic, engaging, Iqbal's call for mental freedom was not a call to isolation. He did not want Muslims to reject the world. He wanted them to lead it. He wanted them to take the best of knowledge, but not lose their faith. To modernize without westernizing. To progress without forgetting the soul. He envisioned a generation that could combine the wisdom of Islam with the tools of modern civilization. A generation that could build with intellect and guide with spirituality. His idea of freedom was deeply rooted in faith. He said that the true believer is never a slave because he bows only before God, and that every form of oppression begins when man bows before something other than God, whether it be wealth, power, or fear. This was his revolution of thought to restore the dignity of belief. He reminded Muslims that Islam is not passive, it is dynamic, creative, and alive. Narrator, strong and steady. He criticized those who had turned religion into mere ritual. He said, "Your prayers have no fire because your hearts have no purpose." He wanted Muslims to stop reciting verses mechanically and start living them. To stop asking what the world could give them and start asking what they could give the world. To reclaim their role as the torchbearers of justice, knowledge, and faith. Iqbal's revolution of thought spread quickly among the youth. They began to see themselves differently, not as victims, but as visionaries. His poetry became their anthem. His ideas became their strength. He had taught them that the greatest enemy is not the oppressor outside, but the weakness within, that the chains of colonialism could be broken only when the chains of ignorance were shattered first. Narrator deep, calm tone in, he warned against dependence on foreign powers, on borrowed ideas, on false heroes. He believed that a nation that does not think for itself can never truly be free. To depend on others for identity is the beginning of decline. He urged Muslims to reconnect with their spiritual heritage, not to live in the past, but to draw power from it. Iqbal's call was radical because it demanded responsibility. He told every individual that they were accountable, not just for their prayers, but for the state of their nation. That faith without action is hypocrisy, and knowledge without character is corruption. Freedom, he said, is not a gift. It is earned through effort, through awakening, through self-realization. Narrator Saleh with slow conviction. His revolution of thought was not loud or violent. It moved quietly like wind through dry leaves, igniting sparks in every corner of the Muslim world. It made people question who they were, what they had become, and what they could be again. He taught them that to rise, they must rediscover their own reflection in the mirror of faith. And so, Iqbal's mission continued to break the chains of mental slavery, to lift the burden of inferiority, to remind his people that their destiny was not written by others. It was waiting for them to write it themselves. How music deepens. A blend of hope and awakening tones, echoing softly as if the earth itself is beginning to stir. He and soft, spiritual music begins, a calm blend of flute and strings, as if a new dawn is rising. Narrator, gentle, deep tone. There comes a moment in history when a single idea changes everything. For Iqbal, that idea was Khudi, the awakening of the self. It wasn't just philosophy, it was revelation. It was the discovery that the key to freedom, power, and destiny lies not outside of man, but within him. While others sought salvation in politics, revolutions, and foreign systems, Iqbal turned inward. He looked into the soul of man and said, "This is where nations rise. This is where empires fall. This is where freedom begins." Narrator, reflective tongue. When Iqbal spoke of Khudi, people misunderstood him. Some thought it meant pride, ego, arrogance. But Iqbal's Khudi was something deeper. It was the divine consciousness within every human being. It was the realization that man is not a creature of weakness, but a reflection of God's creative will. He believed that when a person truly knows himself, he discovers his connection with the Creator. And in that realization, all chains, physical, mental, and spiritual, begin to break. He wrote, "Khudi wo bear hai jiska koi kinara nahi, tu apne aap ko samajha, ye zindagi ka raz hai." To understand Khudi was to understand life itself. Iqbal saw it as the foundation of all progress, the source from which courage, wisdom, and freedom flow. Without Khudi, man drifts like dust in the wind. With Khudi, he becomes a mountain. Narrator Zah passionate, rising voicey, Iqbal saw his people living like shadows, echoing the voices of others, repeating words that weren't their own. They had lost the strength to think, to act, to believe in their own destiny. He wanted to awaken that inner power that once made Muslims the leaders of the world. He said that when man strengthens his Khudi, he becomes fearless because he recognizes that his strength does not come from the world, It comes from God. The concept of Khudi was more than motivation. It was transformation. It was a call to rediscover the soul. Iqbal taught that Allah has given every human being infinite potential. But most people never realize it. They live and die in fear, doubt, and imitation. They wait for miracles without realizing they were created to be the miracle. He wanted to destroy this illusion of weakness. Narrator, softer introspective tone. He explained that the journey of Khudi begins with self-awareness. To know who you are, where you come from, and why you exist. But it doesn't stop there. Once you recognize your own power, you must discipline it, refine it, and direct it toward a higher purpose. Just as a sword must be forged in fire before it can defend truth, Khudi must be purified through struggle before it can shine with divine strength. For Iqbal, Khudi was not self-centered individualism, it was self-respect that leads to service. A man of Khudi is not selfish, he is selfless in the purest way. He does not beg for honor, he earns it. He does not wait for change, he becomes it. He stands firm against oppression, not because of arrogance, but because he knows that dignity is sacred. Narrator, a voice deepens. He said that Allah has given every person the power to shape his destiny. But most people hand that power away. They let society define them, rulers limit them, and fear silence them. Iqbal wanted to return that power to the individual. He said that faith is not passive submission, it is active creation. To believe in God is to believe that you are capable of great things through Him. He reminded his people that when the Prophet Muhammad, our peace be upon him, said, "A believer is never weak," it wasn't a poetic statement. It was a command. It was a reminder that the believer's strength is not in wealth or numbers, but in conviction. And conviction is born from Khudi. Narrator, with rhythm and passion, Iqbal's idea of Khudi changed the entire meaning of freedom. He taught that true liberty is not just the removal of chains, it is the discovery of purpose. A free man without purpose is still lost, but a man of Khudi, even in chains, remains free because his soul cannot be imprisoned. He lives with the certainty that his life has meaning, and that meaning comes from serving a higher cause. He wanted Muslims to rise again as leaders of thought, not as followers of fashion. He told them that Islam had never taught weakness. The Quran, he said, is a book of action, not escape. It commands believers to reflect, to strive, to build, to conquer fear. Iqbal saw Islam not as a religion of retreat, but of revolution, an inner revolution that changes the course of human history. Narrator, slightly softer, but with conviction. He said that the tragedy of his age was not that people had stopped believing in God, but that they had stopped believing in themselves. They prayed to Allah for strength, but doubted their own ability to act. Iqbal reminded them that faith and Khudi are inseparable. To believe in God is to believe in the power He has placed within you. If you distrust yourself, you are, in truth, distrusting your Creator. He often used the metaphor of the eagle, the Shaheen, to describe the man of Khudi. The eagle does not build a nest on the ground. It soars high, unbound by comfort or fear. It hunts in the open sky, facing the storm, mastering its destiny. Iqbal said that Muslims had forgotten how to fly. They had chosen comfort over courage, imitation over independence. He wanted to restore that flight, that instinct to rise above mediocrity and reach the heights of divine purpose. Narrator, energized, emotional tone. Through Khudi, Iqbal redefined what it meant to be human. He said man is not a passive creature controlled by fate. He is a co-creator of his destiny. When man strengthens his will, aligns it with divine purpose, and acts with sincerity, the universe itself bends in his favor. That is the secret of Khudi, to live with such intensity of faith and purpose that even destiny begins to ask, what is your command? He believed that the entire Muslim nation could rise again only when its individuals rediscovered their Khudi. No law, no system, no government could free them until they freed their minds. He said, the path of Khudi is not an easy one. It demands sacrifice, struggle, and faith. But once you begin this journey, you will never walk in darkness again. Narrator's calm, reflective pace. Iqbal's poetry became the guide for this journey. Each verse was a step towards self-realization. He spoke of the stages of Khudi, from awareness to discipline, from discipline to creativity, and from creativity to divine connection. He said that the highest level of Khudi is when a person's will becomes one with the will of God. When man stops living for himself and starts living for truth, justice, and faith, that is when he becomes immortal. He wanted Muslims to stop measuring themselves by what they had lost and start discovering what they still possessed. He said that every man carries within him the potential of prophets, the courage to challenge, the vision to create, the heart to guide. But that potential remains asleep until awakened by Khudi. Narrator, low, soulful tone. Iqbal's idea was not for one nation alone. It was for all humanity. He believed that when man understands his divine connection, he respects life in all its forms. He becomes a servant of truth, not of self-interest. He builds societies based on justice and compassion. He becomes fearless in the face of tyranny because he knows that the only power that truly matters is the power of God. He often said that the greatest sin of man is not to make mistakes, but to underestimate himself, to live below the potential that Allah has given him. He told his people that the time for tears was over. The time for awakening had begun. That a man who knows his Khudi cannot remain silent in the face of oppression, cannot bow to injustice, cannot sell his conscience for comfort. Narrator, rising intensity, almost like a sermon. Iqbal's revolution of Khudi was the foundation upon which the dream of Pakistan would later stand. Because only a people who have rediscovered their selfhood can demand freedom. Only a nation that believes in its own worth can rise to claim its destiny. He knew that empires could fall and borders could change, but the spirit of Khudi, once awakened, could never be conquered again. How the music grows deeper, carrying the rhythm of a heartbeat, slow, strong, unending, like the pulse of a soul discovering its purpose. Shun the sound of footsteps echoes across a vast hall, slow, deliberate, echoing strength. A soft hum of a rising orchestra begins in the background. Narrator's firm, yet deeply reflective tone. When we speak of Iqbal's revolution of thought, we come to a moment where his philosophy breaks the walls of theory and becomes a movement that would awaken not just minds, but an entire civilization. This was the moment when his poetry, his philosophy, and his unshakable faith collided with the burning question, what is freedom? For centuries, Muslims of the subcontinent had lived under the shadow of empire. First the Mughals, then the British. Their hearts were chained not only by foreign rule, but by their own despair. They had forgotten their identity, their strength, and their destiny. The spirit of Islam that once built empires and produced scholars, scientists, and poets had turned into silence. And in that silence, Iqbal heard the cry of a sleeping nation. He asked, how can a nation that once carried the torch of knowledge now live as beggars of thought? How can a people who once ruled hearts now fear to raise their own voices? He understood that before freedom could come to land, it must first come to the soul. Political liberation without inner liberation, he believed, was just another form of slavery, a slavery of the mind. Narrator, slowly, with emphasis. And so, Iqbal began a new kind of jihad, not with the sword, but with words. Not to destroy, but to awaken. His verses were fire and faith woven together. When he wrote, "U to meri dunya ki garibon ko jagadu," it was not merely poetry, it was a command, a divine call to rise from dust and remember who they were. He wanted to shatter the illusion that Muslims were a defeated race. He said that as long as they looked to others for guidance, they would remain lost. Freedom would not come from foreign powers, nor from borrowed ideologies, but from within, from rediscovering the spiritual foundation that once made them leaders of humanity. Iqbal reminded them that Islam was never meant to be confined to rituals or private worship. It was a complete way of life, a system that demanded justice, equality, and courage. He said that Muslims had turned Islam into words, forgetting its power as action. The Quran, he taught, is not a book to be recited in silence, but to be lived with conviction. Narrator, with growing intensity, he saw the Western world rising with science, technology, and new philosophies, but also drowning in materialism and moral emptiness. He admired their intellect, but warned his people not to imitate blindly. He said, "Take knowledge from the West, but not its soul. For their knowledge sharpens the mind, but their greed poisons the heart." He wanted Muslims to learn from the progress of the modern world while keeping their spiritual compass pointed toward God. The East, he believed, had heart but lacked movement. The West had movement but had lost its soul. Iqbal's mission was to unite the two, to awaken a civilization that could combine faith with reason, spirituality with progress, and freedom with responsibility. Narrator, voice, deepens emotional. His poetry became the language of awakening. When he said, Setaran, Ch Jahan ar by Hain, he was teaching Muslims that their destiny lies beyond what they see, that there are new worlds waiting for those who dare to dream. He told the youth to aim not for comfort, but for greatness. He saw in them the spark that could reignite a dead nation. Iqbal's message to the youth was clear: do not seek jobs, seek purpose. Do not look for leaders, become one. Do not wait for miracles, create them. He said that every generation has two choices: to complain about its fate or to rewrite it. And he wanted the Muslim youth to be the generation that rewrote history. He believed that freedom could not be given. It had to be earned through discipline, faith, and struggle. He said, fate does not change until man changes himself. These words were not just a verse from the Quran. They were a declaration of self-responsibility. For Iqbal, the biggest enemy of a nation was not its ruler, but its own laziness, its surrender to hopelessness. Narrator, slower, almost like storytelling. In those years, India was a land of turmoil, divided by race, language, and religion. The British Empire ruled not just by force, but by division. They understood that a divided people could never demand freedom together. Iqbal saw through that design. He told his people that unity could never come from geography or politics alone. It had to come from faith and shared purpose. He said that the Muslims of India were not just another minority. They were a nation bound by history, faith, and destiny. This was a radical idea. It broke the illusion that India was one single nation under British rule. Iqbal declared that Muslims had their own identity, their own values, and therefore their own destiny. That declaration would later become the foundation of Pakistan. He spoke of a homeland where Muslims could live by their principles, not as slaves to the West, not as imitators of others, but as creators of their own civilization. But his vision was not political alone. It was deeply spiritual. He dreamed of a land where freedom would mean more than independence. It would mean the freedom to live by truth, justice, and self-respect. Narrator, a firm, resolute Tony. Iqbal knew that every revolution begins with a seed, a thought that refuses to die. His thought was the seed of Pakistan. He didn't draw maps or design borders. He planted an idea in the hearts of men. That idea grew into a dream, and that dream became a movement. But before the movement could rise, the people had to believe in their own power. He said, nations are born in the hearts of poets. They prosper and die in the hands of politicians. It was his way of saying that true change begins not with laws, but with inspiration. And that inspiration was his gift to his nation. Through his poetry, he built not armies, but believers, men and women who could look into the mirror and see not defeat, but destiny. Narrator, inspirational tone, rising energy. He transformed the definition of patriotism. For Iqbal, love for one's nation was not about territory. It was about purpose. He didn't call for blind nationalism. He called for a revival of faith, a return to values that had once made Muslims the moral compass of the world. He believed that if Muslims rediscovered their spiritual identity, they could rebuild not just a nation, but an entire civilization. He warned that without faith, freedom becomes chaos. Without character, power becomes corruption. And without self-respect, independence becomes illusion. That is why he taught that freedom must begin with self-purification, with truth, integrity, and courage. He wanted every Muslim to be a mirror of the Quran, reflecting wisdom, justice, and strength. His dream of freedom was not just about breaking chains, it was about building character. For Iqbal, freedom without moral strength was like a sword without a blade. Powerful in appearance, but useless in battle. Narrators, quieter, reflective. He saw the modern world chasing wealth and forgetting God. He warned that nations rise not by gold, but by faith. Din si ferai hai to siyasat hoy shaitani, he wrote. When politics abandons faith, it becomes devilish. He wanted his nation to rise with justice, not greed, with unity, not hatred, with truth, not deceit. His revolution was not in streets, but in hearts. He redefined the battlefield, no longer between armies, but between ignorance and awareness, fear and courage, faith and despair. His message was timeless. Strengthen your soul, and the world will bow before you. Narrator, gradually intensifying, as if calling to the listener's conscience. Iqbal's call was not just to Muslims of his time. It was to every generation that finds itself lost, divided or afraid. He wanted us to remember that freedom begins when man refuses to see himself as weak. He said that the chains of slavery are broken not by revolutions alone, but by the rebirth of self-belief. He saw his people sleeping, and he became their voice. He saw their silence, and he became their song. He told them that if they could awaken their faith, their courage, and their Khudi, no empire could ever enslave them again. His words were not meant for the past. They were a mirror for the future. Narrator, low, powerful Tanin. He showed that the journey from slavery to freedom is not walked with swords, but with ideas. Ideas that lift the human soul, that rebuild the nation's dignity, and that connect man to his divine purpose. Her music rises, the sound of drums echoing heartbeat, the rhythm of awakening growing stronger. As if Iqbal's words are still alive, still whispering to every generation that dares to dream of freedom. Pehan, the sound of a pen scratching on paper, begins softly, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat turning into words. Then a quiet recitation of Iqbal's verse echoes in the background. Khudi ko kar bulanditna ki harta dia sipili. The music swells gently, a blend of strings and heartbeat drums. Narrator, steady, reflective tone. When Iqbal spoke of awakening, he wasn't merely talking about the revival of faith or national pride. He was speaking about a revolution, not one that spilled blood on the streets, but one that reshaped the human spirit. His revolution of thought was not aimed at destroying others, but at rebuilding the self. It was about turning weakness into strength, despair into purpose, and servitude into sovereignty of the soul. He looked around and saw a nation that had lost its direction. Muslims of the subcontinent, once the torchbearers of knowledge and justice, were now living as strangers in their own land. They followed foreign systems, admired foreign cultures, and prayed to foreign gods of wealth, and power. Iqbal saw this not just as political slavery, but as spiritual decay. He knew that no law or leader could save a nation that had forgotten its own essence. And so he began where all revolutions begin, within the heart of man. Narrator, softly, with conviction, he believed that you can change the world, you must change yourself. And before you can lead others, you must conquer your own fears. This is why he returned again and again to the idea of Khudi, the divine spark within man, the realization that we are not meant to crawl through life, but to rise, to create, to command. For Iqbal, the problem of his people was not poverty or politics. It was the death of vision. They no longer saw themselves as chosen for a higher purpose. They had become content with survival. He saw their souls asleep, dreaming the dreams of others. And that is why he thundered through his poetry like a storm, calling out to every sleeping heart, "Otho, jago, tumhari takdir tumhe hath mein hai." He knew that when a person discovers his inner strength, he becomes unstoppable. Empires may stand before him, but they cannot contain him. And so, his revolution of thought was not meant for the few. It was a message for every man, woman, and youth who had ever doubted their power to change destiny. Narrator, increasing energy, rhythmic tone. Iqbal's revolution began to connect the dots between the spiritual and the social. He said that true religion is not a retreat from the world, it is the transformation of it. A true believer does not run from life, he masters it. He does not beg for miracles, he becomes one. He explained that the purpose of Islam was to create strong individuals who could build strong societies. Faith, for him, was not about empty rituals, but about action guided by principle. He said, "Deen aur siyasat alag nari ho sakti." Faith and governance cannot be separated, because when faith leaves politics, corruption enters. And when justice leaves society, destruction follows. Iqbal wanted to raise a generation that could live with the Quran, not as a book of the past, but as a living guide, a manual for leadership, creativity, and transformation. He wanted Muslims to study science with the curiosity of scholars, to rule with the justice of Umar, to fight with the courage of Ali, and to serve humanity with the compassion of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Narrator, calmly, then deepens voicey, his revolution was intellectual and moral. He fought ignorance with education, despair with hope, and fear with faith. He told his people that slavery was not just being ruled by others. It was the acceptance of weakness. It was bowing to circumstances instead of shaping them. He said that the man of Khudi bows only before God, not before power or gold. In his lectures and writings, especially the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, Iqbal challenged Muslims to rethink their understanding of faith in the modern world. He said Islam was not meant to freeze in time. It was a dynamic system that encouraged progress, questioning, and renewal. For him, ijtihad, the power to think and interpret, was not a privilege but a duty. He called it the engine of civilization, the force that kept Islam alive through every century. Narrator, passionate tone, rising energy. He wanted to awaken a generation of thinkers, not imitators. He said that Muslims must not copy the West, but neither should they reject it blindly. Instead, they should engage with it, take its knowledge, refine it with their ethics, and create something greater. He often said that faith without knowledge becomes superstition, and knowledge without faith becomes chaos. His dream was to unite the two, to create a civilization where the light of reason shines through the heart of faith. Iqbal saw that the Western world had built machines but lost meaning. They could fly to the stars but had forgotten why. They could create wealth but not happiness. He said, "I'm the mujhko diya ilm kaind az magar, ishq si kolti hai bandi kwaifa sindaji." Knowledge teaches you how to live, but love for God teaches you why to live. For Iqbal, the revolution of thought meant returning to that balance, where man uses science to serve truth, not to replace it. He saw Islam as a force of liberation, not suppression, a faith that inspires creativity, not fear. His goal was not to take Muslims back in time, but to push them forward, to make them pioneers once again in art, science, philosophy, and leadership. Narrator, softer, storytelling tuni, Iqbal's message spread like fire. His words began to echo through universities, mosques, and gatherings. The youth who once saw no future now began to dream again. His poetry became the anthem of awakening. He spoke directly to their hearts, saying, "Jaman tumhari parwais hai fakat, bilandi tak. Tum as men pi by rukjao to hirat hai." He told them that they were not born to live in the shadows of others, but to cast their own light upon the world. He believed that every young person carried within them the same flame that once burned in the hearts of the companions of the Prophet. But that flame needed oxygen, and that oxygen was faith, purpose, and courage. Without it, man becomes just another number in the crowd. With it, he becomes the spark that ignites nations. Iqbal's revolution of thought was therefore not about destruction, but construction. He wanted to rebuild the Muslim identity from its roots. He told them that true freedom is not gained by changing rulers, but by changing minds. And he warned them, if they did not awaken now, they would be swallowed by history once again. Narrator, lower voice, with steady gravity. He said that the tragedy of Muslims was not that they were poor, but that they had forgotten how to dream. The greatest poverty, he believed, was the poverty of vision. He urged his people to dream not of comfort, but of greatness, not of luxury, but of legacy. Tadir ki kazi kaya fatwa hai azal si, hai jormi zefi ki sazamagi mafajat. The law of destiny has always been the same. Weakness leads to death. Strength leads to immortality. He was calling for a mental and moral uprising, a movement that would destroy despair and replace it with dignity. He wanted Muslims to stand tall again, not as subjects of empire, but as builders of civilization. Narrators, rising passion, he said that faith without action is like a seed that never grows, and action without purpose is like a storm that destroys everything in its path. The revolution Iqbal envisioned was both faith that moves mountains and action guided by divine purpose. He believed that once Muslims reconnected with this inner strength, they would no longer need to beg for freedom. They would create it. His message was simple, but it carried the power of prophecy. Awaken your soul, and the world will awaken with you. He wanted his people to understand that every prayer, every effort, every struggle is a step toward divine destiny, and that freedom in its truest form begins when man bows only before his Creator. Narrator, softer, reflective toning. Through his vision, Iqbal gave the Muslim world a mirror, not to show their scars, but their strength. He showed them that they were not lost, they were simply asleep. And once they awakened, their destiny would once again align with the eternal rhythm of truth. He taught that no revolution can last unless it begins in the heart, that no nation can rise unless its people believe, and that no freedom can endure unless it is rooted in faith and purpose. The sound of the pen stops. The music fades into a slow heartbeat, a reminder that Iqbal's revolution still lives in every heart that dares to dream, to act, and to rise. Commemorators, deep, commanding voice. There comes a time in the journey of nations when thought becomes movement and movement becomes destiny. For Iqbal, this was the moment when his philosophy, his dream of spiritual and political freedom began to find its reflection in the hearts of men. It was no longer just poetry, no longer mere ideas. It was now a pulse, a living rhythm flowing through the Muslim youth of India. This was the transformation of thought into action, of Khudi into Qawm, of dream into demand. Iqbal had already sown the seeds of awakening. His call for selfhood had ignited minds. His poetry had broken centuries of silence, and his message had turned hopelessness into hunger. Hunger for honor, for faith, for independence. But he knew that inspiration alone could not build nations. There must come a moment when the dream leaves the mind and walks upon the earth. That moment for Iqbal came in the form of a vision of a separate homeland where Muslims could live, breathe, and rise as a free nation under God. Narrator, steady, emotionally powerful toning. Iqbal's journey to that vision began not with politics, but with faith. He saw that the Muslims of India were losing not just power, but purpose. The British had divided their hearts and minds. Education had turned them into imitators, not innovators. They admired the West's progress, but forgot their own soul. And so, Iqbal began to speak not about parties or elections, but about identity. He asked, "Who are you? What do you stand for? What is your place in history?" He wanted Muslims to rediscover themselves, not as a scattered community, but as a nation with divine purpose. He told them that the unity did not depend on land or language, but on the eternal bond of La ilaha illallah. This was not politics. It was revelation. It was the rediscovery of what made them one body, one soul, one destiny. In his famous Allahabad address of 1930, Iqbal stood before the world and gave voice to what millions had felt but could not express. He declared that the Muslims of India must have a separate homeland, a place where they could live according to their faith, their law and their values. That speech was not just a political proposal. It was a spiritual manifesto. It was the birth of an idea that would, within 2 decades, become narrate us in a slow, reflective voice. But let us understand this. Iqbal's vision was never about division. It was about survival. He saw that Muslims could not preserve their identity in a system where their voice would always be drowned. He said that without political independence, their spiritual independence would fade. For him, Islam was not a private faith, but a complete civilization, one that needed the freedom to breathe, to govern, and to express its divine mission in the modern world. He said, I would like to see the Punjab, North-West Frontier Province, Sindh, and Baluchistan amalgamated into a single state. Self-government within the British Empire or without the British Empire. The formation of a consolidated Muslim state appears to me to be the final destiny of the Muslims. These words were not just political ambition. They were the whisper of destiny itself. Iqbal's vision was not built on hate or separation from others. He never preached hostility toward Hindus or the West. Instead, he believed that Muslims could only serve humanity when they were free to live by their principles. His dream of Pakistan was therefore not of walls and borders, but of spiritual renewal. A land where Islam could once again prove itself as a system of justice, knowledge, and compassion. Narrator, rising energy, confident tone. He saw Pakistan not just as a piece of land, but as a laboratory, a place to rebuild the Muslim identity, to show the world that Islam is not a relic of the past, but a roadmap for the future. A nation guided by the Quran and led by men of character. A nation that would rise not by imitation, but by inspiration. He wanted to show the world that freedom was not about separation from others, but connection with God. Iqbal's dream was not of comfort, but of responsibility. He said that if Muslims gained freedom but lost their moral strength, they would become slaves again, this time slaves to their own desires. He warned that political freedom without spiritual foundation would lead to corruption and decay. And so, he taught that true freedom begins with discipline. He said, freedom is not the absence of law, it is the presence of divine purpose. He saw in the youth the soldiers of this purpose. He told them that they were not born for small dreams. He said, Jawanan! Tomorrow kam, hai dunya ko badal dina. The youth were not meant to inherit the world as it is, but to recreate it as it should be. His poetry became their anthem, his verses their marching song. The call of Shaheen became the call of a new generation to fly high, to live with vision, and to never fear the storm. Narrator's slow emotional reflection. He reminded them of the example of early Muslims, men who built civilization not with wealth, but with willpower, not with swords, but with the strength of belief. He told them that Islam's rise was never about numbers, but about character. When faith is strong, even a handful of believers can move mountains. And when faith is weak, even millions live as slaves. Iqbal said that Muslims must rebuild their character before demanding nations. A corrupt people cannot create a pure homeland. A weak people cannot guard freedom. That is why he urged moral purification, discipline, and unity of purpose. He wanted every Muslim to live as if the future of his nation depended on him, because it did. Narrator self-firm, determined, he also redefined leadership. For Iqbal, a leader was not one who ruled others, but one who ruled himself. He said that the foundation of leadership is character, not power. He wanted a generation of selfless leaders, men who lived not for wealth or position, but for the mission of Islam. He saw in Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah the reflection of that ideal, a man of principles, clarity, and courage. Iqbal supported Jinnah not for politics, but for purpose. He saw in him the embodiment of the disciplined will that his philosophy preached. Their partnership became the meeting of thought and action. The philosopher and the statesman, the pen and the sword of destiny. It was through this union that the dream of Pakistan began to take its real shape. Narrator, passionate, voice rising like a wave. And as Iqbal's words spread, the idea of Pakistan began to move through villages, cities, and universities like a current of faith. It was not just a movement for land, it was a call for dignity. Every Muslim, from the poorest farmer to the most educated scholar, began to feel the pulse of his own worth. They realized that they were not a dying people, but a sleeping giant awakening to its destiny. Iqbal had told them that nations are born in the hearts of poets, but they live through the courage of the people. His dream was now alive in millions of hearts. The slogans of freedom echoed his verses. The cries of Pakistan Zindabad carried his spirit. The revolution of thought had now become a revolution of faith. Narrator slower, solemn toned. And yet, Iqbal never lived to see the birth of the country he had dreamed of. But perhaps that was never his role. His task was to awaken, to plant the seed, to light the torch, to stir the soul of a people who had forgotten how to dream. And when that dream took root, when it became unstoppable, his mission was complete. Iqbal's revolution of thought had transformed a defeated people into a nation of believers. He had taken them from slavery to selfhood, from silence to song, from despair to destiny. His words had given them not only a homeland, but a reason to live and a mission to fulfill. And the music rises again, slow drums, heartbeat rhythm, swelling into a symphony of purpose, as if the spirit of Iqbal's dream still echoes in the wind, calling to every heart that dares to believe in freedom built upon faith. E-narrator, steady, evocative voice. There are moments in history when an idea becomes immortal, when the dream of one man becomes the destiny of millions. Iqbal's revolution of thought was not just the spark that lit the flame of Pakistan. It was the spirit that continues to guide its people even today. But to understand the final chapter of this revolution, we must look beyond 1947. Because for Iqbal, freedom was not the end of the journey, it was the beginning of a greater responsibility, the rebirth of the Muslim soul and the revival of a lost civilization. Iqbal never imagined freedom as mere geography or politics. He saw it as a sacred trust, a divine test of what a nation could build when guided by the principles of truth, justice, and self-respect. He believed that a nation is truly free only when its people are free, not just from the rule of others, but from the chains within themselves. The chain of fear, the chain of greed, the chain of imitation, the chain of self-doubt. These were the real enemies that Iqbal fought against through his poetry and philosophy. He wanted Muslims to understand that political independence would mean nothing if they lost their spiritual independence. The revolution he envisioned was not limited to the creation of Pakistan, but to the creation of a new kind of human being. Insani, Kamil, the complete man. A believer who stands upright in faith, who acts with justice, who serves humanity without seeking reward. This was the man Iqbal saw as the foundation of a true Islamic society. Narrator, chest inspiring, voice rising with emotion, he said that Muslims must not stop at freedom. They must build a civilization that reflects the light of Islam, a civilization that combines science and spirituality, faith and reason, art and action. Iqbal believed that the Quran was not a book of rituals, but a manual for life. It commands man to think, to question, to explore the universe. He reminded Muslims that Islam does not fear progress, it leads it. The problem was never science, it was the loss of spirit. When knowledge is connected to faith, it becomes wisdom. When it is disconnected, it becomes destruction. He wanted Pakistan to be the land where this balance could be restored, where modern education would walk hand in hand with moral education, where economic progress would not crush justice, where political power would serve the weak, not the powerful. Iqbal dreamed of a state that was not secular in the Western sense, nor theocratic in the medieval sense, but something greater, a spiritual democracy where every citizen is valued not by wealth or class, but by character and contribution. He said that democracy without morality is tyranny, and freedom without purpose is chaos. And so, he called for a system that reflects the essence of Islam: equality, accountability, and compassion. He wanted rulers who serve the people, scholars who guide with wisdom, and youth who live for something greater than themselves. In his view, the greatest tragedy of nations is not when they are defeated by enemies, but when they are betrayed by their own weakness. Narrator, slower, reflective tone. Iqbal's final message was one of reconstruction. He wrote, the reconstruction of religious thought in Islam, not as a philosopher locked in theory, but as a visionary who saw the future of Muslim civilization hanging in balance. He urged Muslims to reinterpret Islam in the light of modern challenges, not to dilute it, but to reveal its eternal power. He believed that Islam must not be static because life itself is movement. The principles of Islam are eternal, but their application must evolve with time. He warned against blind imitation, whether of the West or of the past. He said, a living nation must create, not copy. He wanted Muslims to rediscover ijtihad, the courage to think independently within the framework of faith. To him, this was the essence of freedom. Without intellectual courage, nations fall into stagnation. Without spiritual roots, they lose their soul. Iqbal dreamed of a generation that could think boldly, act justly, and live fearlessly. He said, the ultimate aim of the ego is not to see something, but to be something. That is what freedom meant to him. The power to become what God intended man to be. Narrator, voice deepens, more commanding. Iqbal's revolution was not against others, it was against the decay within. He called Muslims to rise above sects, tribes, and personal interests. He said that unity was not about uniformity, but about shared purpose. The Muslim world could never rise until it learned to see itself as one body, one soul, one Ummah. He saw the Muslim youth not as followers of the past, but as creators of the future. He wanted them to reclaim the legacy of those who once led the world in knowledge, justice, and discovery. He told them that they were not born to live small, fearful lives. They were the heirs of a divine mission. Their role was to carry the torch of truth in a world sinking into materialism. He said, Tumhara disan pe kambar hai, tum pe hambar ki qaum ho. You are the nation of a prophet. And that means you are meant to lead by example, not by domination. Leadership for Iqbal was moral, not mechanical. It came from the strength of the heart, not the sword. Narrator thus softly, as if speaking to the soul. And yet, even as he dreamed of a glorious future, Iqbal was painfully aware of the dangers that awaited. He warned that once freedom is achieved, nations often forget why they fought for it. He feared that Muslims might gain a homeland but lose the spirit that made it necessary. He wrote, Wo kam jo zinda wakaran samaram hai, wo kak hai, paikar yi joan nahi. A nation without living values is nothing more than dust. For him, Pakistan was not to be another kingdom, but a movement, a living laboratory where Islam could prove its relevance to the modern age. It was to be a place of justice, education, and unity, a beacon for the entire Muslim world. And that is why his message remains alive today. Because his revolution was never just for one generation. It was for every era where Muslims stand at the crossroads between slavery and freedom. Narrator, voice grows stronger. Stirring emotion, he called upon every believer to become a builder of destiny, not a victim of history. He reminded them that the world does not change through speeches or slogans. It changes through character and courage. Every time a Muslim chooses integrity over corruption, truth over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness, Iqbal's dream breathes again. Every time a youth believes he can rise above despair, every time a woman educates another child, every time a man stands for justice, even when alone, that is Iqbal's revolution continuing. He taught that freedom is not a gift, it is a duty. It must be renewed every day through action, learning, and faith. He said that the real task of Muslims is to prove to the world that Islam can still create a civilization of peace, progress, and purpose. And that begins not in parliaments or palaces, but in hearts, in the awakening of the self. Narrator, voice lowers, solemn and powerful, Iqbal's message, if truly understood, tells us that the journey from slavery to freedom is not just political, it is spiritual. It begins with the liberation of the mind, with the revival of belief in one's own worth, and with the courage to live by principles, even when the world mocks them. He showed that a nation rises when its people rediscover their connection, the divine, when they see life not as survival, but as service. That is the revolution he left behind, not one of swords and banners, but of hearts and souls. A revolution that calls every Muslim to rise again, to reclaim the greatness that once defined their history, and to build a world that reflects the eternal truth of La ilaha illallah. The music swells, a crescendo of drums and violins, as the narrator's voice fades into the sound of wind and prayer, leaving behind a silence filled with purpose and remembrance.